Pádraig le ceann de na híomhána is cáúla de éirí amach 19 tafad a dhéanamh ar an nómad a dhéal na Réabhlóinig. Ceannaire a bháin mílete ag géile de cheannaire eile. Ach spragan an tíomhá neamhtheléirsa a úsátar i gúntais éagsúla ar stair na héireann níos mó ceistena ná freagraí. Ní bhuairthas riamh an buncóp den ghianghraif. Ní fis céir bhé an ghianghraif a dóir, agus is mistéire cén fág a bhfuil péire eile cos a banas cosúil le feiscinnta bhealach taobh hir de Pádraig Pearse. Céir a bhí an bheansa a bhí láthir ag an ngéile, cén fánach bhfuil a cosa le feiscinn sa ghianghraifsa. An bhfuil si fág ar láir de éanach nó ó nóméid canúnachsa agus cén bhaint a bhí céile hairí amach 19.
Get the man back!
Seachtain na cásca 19 bheart ag buin Réabhlónithe éirí amach rúnda I gine rial lenú na chasanna in éireann. Cé gur tepach ar mórán dá blanan na rihré, hí na ceannarí máte lenún dá martais le súlga spragacha dóir ar an sírse muintir na héireann. Ar an bheitthe cearú láda a brá 19 dógur Pádraig Pearse bunú phoblach na héireann. Ba é ardafig an fuist ceann chearú an rialta sealadig, áitribh tíchiad sa caige den na Réabhlónithe ag trid go díhalach chun an phoblach a bhanú. Ina measc bhí suas le dad ban, bhuiil de agrais phoblachta ar nós cuman na man agus in íonacha na héireann. Idir bís a bheith ghuala ar ghuala lena ggópáirte ag amsa na cinúna.
Bhí meon náisiúnaíoch a chothú sa timpolacht solar ghlach siad páirt in éirí amach 19 agus níor bhac sé sin le hinscinne. Ní roion bhaintse go sin le hinscinne, bhí bunte go sin leis an meon a bhí a chothú agus ar thuig siad haon ón meon sin go raibh deis an daoife cóionanas agus carraíocht a bhain semach leis na fear agus ba rud é sin nach raibh acu faoi rialtas na Breataine.
In the GPO, through the day, women came and there was basically 3 roles. There were the women who were involved in the cooking, there were women who were involved in first aid, and then there were the women who would carry courier messages from the GPO to the various garrisons, because this was the only way that they could communicate.
I measc na man a bhí sa GPO le na Réabhlónithe bhí Elizabeth O'Farrell, lochlíoch tríocha bliain d'aois. Hastal sí lena Cara Julia Grennan chuig an iarthar níos lothe sa teachtain chun scéala faoin éirí amach a scape ar fille ar bhlachlíoch an troda.
Elizabeth O'Farrell was my grandmother's first cousin, known as Lizzie O'Farrell in the family. From what I've been told, she was a feisty young woman, a mind of her own. She was reared down in a thriving dockland. It was the engine of Ireland at the time. And whether she just fell head over heels in love with the whole idea of republicanism or she was easily led, I really don't know.
Her father was a dock labourer, they were a working class family. They would have not been a political family. But when she became involved as a young girl with cultural nationalism through Innian Heron, through the Irish language, she absorbed the ethos of the Gaelic League, the ethos of Irish Ireland, this new politics, nationalism. So she would have been coming at it from socialist republicanism, if you like. Now, Elizabeth O'Farrell was not a nurse. She's often called a nurse, but they would have trained in first aid. The couriers and the first aiders would have worn what was identifiable as a Red Cross uniform, which is the white apron, the Red Cross and the Red Cross on the arm.
The attitude of the leaders to women really was quite varied, and you're really looking at a range of views. James Connolly, who was in many respects a feminist and who was an egalitarian and believed that women should not just participate in the Easter Rising, but that they should play a full role, and women could serve as soldiers in the Irish Citizen Army. And then if you want to look at the other extreme, you've got someone like Eamon de Valera, whose views on women reflected very much the Catholic nationalist views of the day, and they should do things which, according to a kind of a gendered notion of acceptable behaviour for women. In
terms of what the women were doing, and in terms of the world they lived in, they didn't see themselves in a position of being less than. They saw they were part of this rebel army and everybody was there together.
Faoi dhearan na seachtaine, bhí sé sa léir nach bheith faoi seilbh chimáidir an GPO a bhd eile, agus bheartaigh an fíorseach scaoile le bhór na man. Ach, chuireadh ceistir shrúir, Winifred Carney, Julia Grennan agus Elizabeth O'Farrell fnacht an éanacht leis na bharibh.
Faoi dheardaí na seachtaine móide an áiríad hiag na ceannarí gur caite bhíonn sa. Higged an chríoch bheith leis rud fad. Agus an rud is mó beidir a bhí déanana bhíimní dóibh ná chunas iatidís iradegus sa beidir duna fir, a chuirt slánas an gátar, chunas iatidís téirmí dáil a bheith onórach, agus chunas iatidís daine dhéanamhde gomach an túrisk a raibh diantacha onórach.
I think it was apparent from the outset that the rebellion was destined to failure. It was certainly understood by the leaders. It probably wasn't understood by some of the rank and file because they didn't know very much about the wider context. They didn't know how much the nationwide plans for the rising had been compromised.
Faoi an ine, agus an GPO ans na trihí, dénach cinenne cúlú go taxábháilta shráidí bhórga. Tros cún túirteach a dhéanana firis man ná bheith únsaí fíochhar gunna. Buineach teisle as Elizabeth agus Hitchie, ach heirigh cumráda leihí slánaí.
And it was only at this stage of the rising that the rebel leaders really saw what the impact of the rising had been around them in Dublin, and they saw the devastation which had been inflicted by British artillery and machine guns on civilians' houses. And of course they began to see the level of civilian casualties that was taking place in the Moore Street area. So for some of them it was quite kind of shocking to see what had been happening around them. It does raise the issue of a certain kind of naivety or perhaps even callousness. I mean, what did they think would be the outcome of having a rebellion and locating it in the middle of, you know, a working class area of Dublin?
Fada sa bhí Elizabeth, Julia agus Winifred ag tindáilir na fir gortathe shráidí bhórga, chan cúigar bald an réaltas sealadach, for bhór na híthe, agus an bhaid an dar gion ag déanamh macnamh an chiad céim eile.
Daríar a píre ní éitidís ag an buinte san a bheith cinnte céimar a ghlachfaí leis rud a bhí déanta. Bhí idir có mórtrí na chéile. Bhí túir míoch dain fa cad a cheapig caddearigh an stair le es mór mar a deartha. Ach ní éitidís a bheith cinnte céimar a ghlachfaí leis rud áirithe sa geard nó sa bhaid herma.
Lórítar go minic faoi íbert ola agus a lehéid siúd. Ag toigú na daoine seo le héamhanna ar nós cúcholainn agus ba iad na léachra ba bhó a bhí ag an bírsach ar nói na cúcholainn, an rud ba bhó a bhí an insin na geanarí sin na an rud ceart a dheanú, agus teigú dífa ag an fonte sin gur a bheith an rud a bachirte a dheanú ag an fonte sin na géalú.
Agus bhí eilis ní airí le náid fíor frihléideach. Nuair a bhí na córáití se ar ban, nuair a bhí an cor agus a cúite ar ban, agus bhí si héin lárnach in san bhíorhearnacht an dráma san, an clásúr den éirí amach.
Fé bhain léir an saharan, le cinenne dianta go ngéiledís chun téile cailún síla hachant, dúmpig na Canary i Joe Elizabeth.
When the leaders decided they would have to surrender, Elizabeth was chosen to carry the surrender. She was chosen because of the three women. She was solid, she was steady, and they knew they could trust her to do it. She just had this way, you know, she would stay calm, and that was why they sent the woman in a Red Cross uniform, and a steady woman at that.
Go practicúil balúin chance bheith an go scaoile le ban go háirí le brat bán, so ondaibh sin de bhí se leile réasún. Ban chróga, ban ábalta, ban nach dóigh go scaoilfaí í agus brat bánacha.
Crochach brat bán amach an nóig an tí ar shráidí bhórga, agus thug Elizabeth faoin na tros go ceann áras or sí na breataine.
Ligú amachaí, scéalú amachaí, go lear na carach, agus bhí urachar ascailú fod na háte. Bhí si muil báis ní ró mar chosint aici ach brat bán.
Well, it was a very brave, dynamic journey, whatever way you look at it. Did she have time to think about it when she was asked? Did she rehearse it in her head? Did she just take the bloody thing and run with it? She would have known her city well, and if she's walking down the street, she probably steely-eyed looked them in the eye and said, well, don't mess with me too much. And sometimes if you act the role, you play it out.
Séis de haidúí na breatainna caithfh go donna lethe ag an ngarastún agus cuireann na le go spiadóir a bhí ionte. Tháinig ceannaire arm na breatainna im lá clia an ghinearál lo, agus a bhac a bhí mar chúntóirige an láthir.
The Commandant General of the IRA wishes to treat with the head of the British forces in Ireland.
I was present at the surrender. A nurse in Red Cross uniform came in to headquarters, my father's headquarters, with a message from Pearse, who was the revolutionary commander-in-chief or commander, saying he wished to surrender. So then my father told me to take a letter, which I did, and that is the letter, that is my handwriting.
Tell Mr. Pearse will do in person. Soldier, turn the lady's arm down.
Déal Elizabeth an taxábháilta Fráidí Bhórga leis an nóta san, le ordathe don bíorseach dul an éanach leith in Gaeile. Dul a bhíh na ceannaire hain don nómad súntasach sa, agus gléis an fíorseach a hain go slacht for an éide mílete, chun aigehúirt cheannaire an náid.
Pearse saw himself as the president of the Irish Republic. He was the figure who personified the Easter Rising, and he was hugely aware of its historic significance. And his main role, really, I think, during Easter week was to invest the rebellion with a kind of dignity and a kind of gravitas. So I think he probably wasn't thinking about himself so much as thinking about his exalted position as Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Republic when he made those preparations and when he stepped out to treat with Britain. He was doing so as leader of the Irish Republic.
Bhí gríongrafador a nahanna de láthir nuair a dhéal an Pearseach i mí a brán 19 agus tá nómad starúlsa cheantas na gríongrafanna is taobhsúla is stair na héireann. Tá sa gona níis, cé bhíodh seasamh go dílis taobh leis an Pearseach in uairsa na cinúna. Ach, nuair a fáil siach an íomhása den chiadúir sa nuachta an breatainach the Daily Sketch, de láit sééis an dhéile, bhí gacha an rian to Elizabeth O'Farrell i methe as Ryark.
Well, the Daily Sketch image has clearly been heavily retouched. Not unusual for that period, but you can see that they've cleaned up the photograph. They've taken out a lot of the messy elements, and obviously from their point of view, one of the messy elements were the extra pair of feet.
Well, in éidir sa séide, bhí sais technoliaach down in Inglaterra photomontage. Séir de tá ann ná go gurdair Piasa Pápéir thart timpeall ar cosa an Fiorsaach, go haingiad ar isteach an cosán, na crackanna sa cosán, chun go mbeadh sais an tíofacht éigean ag buint leis, agus slacht ag an curthair agus cosa Elizabeth O'Farrell buinte de.
If you look at even the expressions on the faces of the two soldiers on the left, you can see they've almost become cartoonish, such as the extent of the retouching.
Well, caiid is muineh go bhfuil an Daily Sketch mar sais tabloid ag an am, agus tá an céad ceithre leathanach i gcónaí gafa le pictúirí. Fiú bháin an headline, Pádraig H. Pearse, shot. The dhéal sé sin nuachtán.
You're talking about a front page display, so you want something quite graphic that's jumping off the page. For the editors of the paper, the feat would have presented the same problem as if a lamppost was growing out of Pádraig Pearse's head.
Bin cinna agrahorta.
agus sinile, bhí sé tágtach ní raibh sí.
There's quite a long history of retouching of photographs. The one that most immediately comes to my mind historically would be the Stalinist period in Russia, as various people were murdered by Stalin and had to be retouched out of the photograph, and history recreated, as in these people no longer existed, in that they'd been murdered, but it wasn't enough to murder them, they had to disappear from history.
Ní cuairt riamh chuiristeach nó aonsáis tíomhála dhéanamh ar cápéis nó ar griangraf starúil. Ach ag an am, ní raidir ag smuoinmh gur sais fianaise stara a bheoh in úsáid i 2011.
Fuairthas cóp den griangraf níos déanaí agus buna chúsáid as go poiblí chun in éirí amach a chomóra. Cé go grothíonn an fictúr go raibh Elizabeth a láthir ag an ngéile or daana ní bhá ceistena eile. Cén fánach bfuil le feiscinte ach a cosa, agus céigean an cinenne í chiimeád faoi chealt.
Mar foinse starúil caafar anna cuid ceistena a chur Marialler an Greengrass seo, le haig, just dúrach Star 101, caiitú an cé ceiste chur céthóg an Greengrass seo, agus níl antólas anna gin. Caiitú smuid ar an cadre a bhí idir an Greengraffador agus an subject mar déirtha. Tá an Greengrass seo anna aisteach. Tá sé sais blurred freisin, tá ceistena ann an é seán fíorsa gur an gédal sios.
The print you have here is quite a dark and contrasty print, so we're guessing a little bit here in terms of any detail that's in the shadows. It looks like a set-up photograph in the sense that it looks like in some way either the photograph was posed or the actual surrender was arranged quite carefully in terms of where people stood. It doesn't look like a candid photograph, it looks like quite a formal process.
Más griangraf curra I géile bhí gceist, an bhfuil lábhaint fíorseach le bra ar an torra. Bhí cáil ar siúd riamh gur cheamáid sé smacht ar a íomha poiblí.
Bhí sé an mhórtasach as an chuma agus an éha a léireoch sé os cór an phobail agus bhí sé an mhórtasach ó bhí sé ina lad óg mar big picture atá ar fáil faoin bíorsach fiú agus é ina lad óg ina arcan sé díreach ar chamara tuisguró machil súla gceist agus a lehéid siúd.
Ní dólim gur chóidig an Pearse sin. Ní léon áras nechar ná gur chóidig sé gachro deile áfach. Heasta go an Pearse go bheici mar cheanare ar arm díreach mar a bhí an fearrás a chóid amach, agus go meach díine ceanna baint lena úmpar féin. Agus an déobh sin de péród híl sé go éilis níarí agus a crógacht agus mar sin de. Dearing go raibh sé smaoineh ar an simbalacha a bhain lena dhéile féin, níos mó ná rudarbe eile ins na nómaidí dearnacha sin.
Sna blianta a lean agus an fictúr in na ábhardí spóireachta chuirch ceistear Elizabeth a legan den scéal a thuirt chun deide a chuir leis an gunspóid. Dúirt Elizabeth gur bhí héin a heas siar gan é a thuirt mar hásamh de bholscaireacht nuachta an hasanna.
Ní líon chúis ón méide tá deanta agamsa ar seo, ní líon rud léite agam a chur an úldú go mó éon bhainteiste dithe le bréig a insint faoi sin.
We'll never know why she didn't want to be in the photograph, but she was not to know that she had stepped out of an iconic image. How would she know that? With hindsight. But if she'd known, she might have stayed.
Ní ró éon rud le buachint as a bheith sa ficture ina túram héan. Déine sin star rud eile ar fad dúin le haach dáma ar nói. Ach sílam gur rud eile ar fad atá gceist lei sin gur go leor moníine eici eiste héan. Nar gadaí a bheith sa spot tholas ag an nóméid ceanúnach seo.
Ar nós pictúr an chéile, bhí scéalan na ghála agus curchan báis na ganarí ar phríomhlehannig na nuachtáin. Siad na híomhána agus na scéalta leistíordómhsa a ghathraigh mion an phobal i lehantáirí amach.
Go garid in ígan éirí amach nuair a tháinig scéalta na ganarí amach céar bhíad cad an cúra bhíocha. Agus go spéisialta cé mar a cathúiad agus mar a dumpar siad héin. Agus faoi nám go raibh an díaltas baint amach chuidir a gás agus an pianós chutha i grích. Bhí mion an phobal i lena ganarí áirithe ar fad. Mar sin de bhuaig ceannarí an éirí amach an cogad bholscaireachta. No, cuir mar a grí seo hé. Hep ar an éirí amach ó hebh dul i bhaim go mílete le lín na seachtain na móide. Ach deirig leis an éirí amach an tahrú meoin seo a hálaigh na ceannarí a chuirí grích ar an bobbal náisiúnach. Agus bhí teannachar fadthearmach aige sin, agus dearach daoine go raibh teannachar fadthearmach aige sin ar stair na héireann ó hinine le.
Bhí cinúntaí agsúla in andómh súda bhí sa Réangraf ícónachsa in ag an éirí amach. Cuireadh Pádraig Pearse uachtarán na poblachta an báis i brísún Chilmhaineann. Bheadh mac an generál lo atá ag seasamh le heise ahar sa fictúd in na réalscanán na Hollywood faoin ainm John Loder. Ar ordú an general lo, cha Elizabeth O'Farrell an Ládar Gionn ag scapa fógra faoin ngéile ar na garastún eile. Dá bhar son, níor georacht téirme fad a prísúnaise as ocht a roundfortíocht san éirí amach. Agus in ag de éidir na crise deirige a bheith á chahabhacha le linn seachtain na cásca, cálacha ar deire mar vanaltra.
After the rising, she remained a fervent Republican. She was still a member of Cumann na Món. She then joined Holles Street Hospital and became a certified midwife. She took it up seriously and continued her midwifery practice. She was a self-fulfilling woman, without a doubt she was.
Now Farrell, like a lot of these women, had very profound revolutionary sentiments of her own. After the Easter Rising, she didn't become part of the sort of cosy state commemoration of the rebellion because she felt that the Free State was a sellout. And after De Valera took power, she also fell out with De Valera and in fact remained a supporter of militant republicanism right up into the 1950s.
Níor éir Elizabeth riamh in fabliacht as a róil san éirí amach, agus in ainóna chud crógachta dénach éirscóba idir as mór an tuairiscí agus cúntais ar stair na héireann. In áirníireachtaí deire a chur le ceisna faoin Réangrafsa, d'fhaighidh linn teachtar fronta sípia a bhí fáilte le déanaí ag an Músaeum Náisiúnta. Éiríonn leis an gcópsa den giadúir da a chur sa Réangraf, agus taspáinne sé go bhfuil Elizabeth níos sa eiceas an íomhá starúilsa ná mar a haghlaigh éina riamh.
This is the original, which actually shows Nurse O'Farrell, her feet, her clothing, her cape, and in fact far more of her than I had expected. It's small but an interesting little document, and it does help to put some of the hairier stories and rumours as to bed. You can see from waist level down at the back a whole run of Nurse O'Farrell's outer cape and indeed her white nurse's dress, and even the shape and style of shoe. There is a level of detail that is just not coming up in black and white.
Mar sin, léiríonn an Réangrafsa nach raibh cóta riamh á chahabhaigh an Pearseach, mar a tugadh le fios sa chópdómh agus bán.
You can actually for the first time see the real Pádraig Pearse, as it were, as distinct from Nurse O'Farrell. A lot more of her than we thought was there, and she's very, very obvious.
Léiríonn an íomhása go raibh Elizabeth ina lorga bacht ag am na cinúna is stair na héireann. Tá eiscéal féin mar aon le gascí maná agus mion charach déirí eile ón teachtain réabhlóideach sin I mbeithe le srudan chuid is mó ó gnáíonn sin staire or náisiún Gaelach.
When we look back on the heroes of 1916, and undoubtedly there were many, but we can't for one second forget the women. They were heroines. They were strong. They were staunch. They had a vision every bit as much as the men.
Candas na dachrachtaí a bhhaineas le rón amán san éirí amach. Ná, gur léitear an scéalson, agus gur ligeadh an scéalson in arúd freisin, tar éis néidir go fios a dó. Nuair a tháinig ann in san séir stát agus sa stát éileide. Nuair a tháinig ann do stát agus pobl agus sochaí agus leagan amach sóisialta a bhí cuimeádach tradiisiúnta agus a thug ról tánaisteachta na maná. Ról cho tánaisteach is gur dachar a hallú go minic, gur raibh an irid san smuointe radicacha.
I think that in terms of Irish history, women do get a raw deal. And when young students, male or female, come across women in Irish history in the 20th century, they're presented with the iconography of Maud Gonne and Countess Markievicz. And people like Elizabeth O'Farrell and the hundreds of female foot soldiers who were involved from 1916 onwards are completely ignored. And they are still ignored almost 100 years later. What has happened is they have concentrated on a form of romantic version of history, which could almost be called historical chick lit.
Braham go mé Camóra éideag séideag in fithe sééig aonanta spéisiúil go deo mar dearthaín haon go mé léamh omlan jefriúil ar imachtaí agus ar achtraí starúile nééig sééig ag an fonte sin. Mar sílam go bhfuil stadas na man bonse maithe an fonte seo, go neithnítar ról na man sna heachtraí starúile seo agus gur ga an stadas sin a bhronú arthú.
Tá cúpla slí agus buchas le dia go bhfuil lomad mar de legan den órán an seanrod gáin ar gach scéil agus seach legan de gach órán. Is mar a chéiletá se leis a stair. Tá stair na ganarí táchtach. Tá na pásanna móra a dhéanans cinine táhachtach do chuoine. Ach na pásanna eile a bhí páirteach sa stair agus go spéisialtar nachtra mar 9 Pásanna beidir nach bhfuil an aithneid ach tá imalach nó go bhfuil imalú diantartha. Is gá agus is táchtach go dúirthaí a gceart dóibh san chomá, mar bhíon léamh eile a ring ar an achtra trí na súile siad san agus trí a scéalta siad san.